Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The End of Empire, Attila the Hun and the Fall of Rome, by Christopher Kelly, narrated by Michael Page. Now what will become of us without barbarians? Those people were some kind of solution. Constantine Cavafy, Waiting for the Barbarians, 1898. Prologue. The Strava of Attila the Hun. Carefully concealed in the long grass that covered the plain, the Roman spies watched with growing fear and amazement. In the center of a cluster of tents pitched between wagons stood a splendid silken pavilion. Its open sides allowed a clear view of the body of Attila the Hun. He was short, with a broad chest and a large head. Those who had seen him while alive reported that his eyes were small, his beard sparse and flecked with grey, his nose flattish, and his complexion dark. This was the powerful physique of a man who had died suddenly in his prime, a battle-hardened warrior used to fighting and to travelling for hours on horseback. This was the brilliant commander who had transformed a disorderly band of smash-and-grab nomads into a disciplined force that in the first half of the 5th century A.D. had marched 1,000 miles across Europe from the shores of the Black Sea in Romania to the fertile fields of Champagne in France. Attila the Hun was one of the most frightening enemies ever faced by the Romans. In lightning raids, his army destroyed dozens of prosperous and wealthy cities that had remained secure for centuries, and even threatened Rome, the eternal city, itself. The Huns honored Attila in death as in life. His body, draped in rare oriental silks, glittered with magnificent jewelry, costly gifts from Roman emperors hoping to buy off an enemy whom they had repeatedly failed to defeat. On his shoulder gleamed a great golden brooch set with a single slice of onyx the size of a man's palm. Like the dark waters of the Danube glinting in the sharp summer sun, the deep purple stone flashed with the fire of burning brands held high by the horsemen riding wildly around the tent. The faces of these young men were disfigured and smeared with blood. According to the Roman historian Priscus of Panium, they had cut their long hair and slashed their cheeks, so that the greatest of all warriors should be mourned not with tears or the wailing of women, but with the blood of men. Then followed a day of grief, feasting, and funeral games, a combination of celebration and lamentation that had a long history in the ancient world. Priscus may have been reminded of the games, movingly described by Homer, that the Greek hero Achilles held for his fallen companion Patroclus before the walls of Troy. 12 centuries after Homer, the Huns raced horses to salute the achievements of their dead leader. That night, far beyond the frontiers of the Roman Empire, Attila was buried. His body was encased in 3 coffins, the innermost covered in gold, a second in silver, and a third in iron. The gold and silver symbolized the plunder that Attila had seized, while the harsh grey iron recalled his victories in war. The tomb was filled with the weapons of enemies defeated in battle, precious jewels, and other treasures. The servants responsible for preparing the burial were killed so that they could not reveal its location. These too were honourable deaths, part of the Strava, the Hunnic for a funeral, and thanks to Priscus' account the only word of Hunnic to have survived. What most impressed the Romans secretly watching these ceremonies was the dirge solemnly intoned by the horsemen who galloped around Attila's tent. It was a slow, deep, rhythmical chant commemorating a great leader who had established an empire for his own people and hastened the collapse of Roman rule in Western Europe. No Roman could hear these words without remembering the terror that Attila had inspired. No Hun could ask for a more fitting epitaph. Attila the king, chief of the Huns, born of his father Mundjuk, lord of the bravest tribes, he who captured cities, he who brought fear to the Romans and their empire. Their prayers moved him. He accepted payments each year to save the rest from plunder. Attila accomplished all this through his great good fortune. He fell not by an enemy's blow, nor by the treachery of his own followers, but he died peacefully, happy in his joy, without pain, his people safe. Who can call this death, when none considers that it demands vengeance? Part 1. Before Attila. Chapter 1. First Contact. No one in the Roman Empire had ever heard of the Huns. It was not until the 370s, a generation before the birth of Attila, that they first fought their way into history. Then reports reached Roman troops guarding the Danube frontier of the sudden appearance of a savage people north of the Black Sea. It was not known how far they had travelled. The possibilities ranging from Mongolia to Kazakhstan will be explored at the end of Chapter 3. The newcomers were led by fierce warriors on horseback. Their families followed slowly in covered wagons. Moving west across the steppes of Asia, they brought terror and disruption to the edges of Europe. Around the Black Sea, in modern Ukraine and Romania, the Huns encountered the Goths. First the Grutungi, the collective label Roman observers applied to those who controlled the territory between the Don and the Dniester rivers, and then the Tervingi, between the Dniester and the Danube. In 375, the Tervingi leader Athanaric marched north to reinforce a group of Grutungi pushed back by the Huns' advance. The campaign was unsuccessful. Athanaric's camp on the banks of the Dniester was attacked in the night by Huns who had forded the river by moonlight. The Tervingi troops scattered, and the Huns swept onward, in the words of one Roman historian, like an avalanche from the mountain-tops, carrying away or destroying everything in their path. Athanaric's failure to halt the Huns was only to be expected. 6 years earlier he had negotiated the end of a war with the Roman Emperor Valens. Although they had avoided a major battle, 3 years of intermittent conflict had wrecked the Tervingi's farms and villages. The slow recovery weakened Athanaric's authority, and a number of high-ranking Tervingi now openly contested his right to rule. Fritigern was the most ambitious. Rebuffed in his first challenge in the early 370s, he had taken refuge inside the Roman Empire. His second attempt to seize power was financed by Valens. In bankrolling Fritigern, the emperor hoped to engineer Athanaric's downfall and his replacement by a more cooperative regime. Roman interference in Tervingi internal affairs could not have come at a worse time. Fritigern's opposition undermined the Goths' attempts to defend their territory. He had no intention of joining Athanaric and continuing the fight, preferring to retreat rather than face the Huns. In spring 376, Fritigern and his ally Alavivus ordered their followers to head straight for the Danube. Pressing hard against the Roman frontier, 80,000 Tervingi insisted that they had nowhere to go but into the empire. In the dramatic vision of one Roman contemporary, a great crowd standing on the opposite river banks stretched out their hands with cries and lamentations, begging to be allowed to cross. Valens granted their request. To refuse was too dangerous. The Danube defences were not strong enough to hold back such large numbers, nor could reinforcements be brought up quickly. The bulk of the Roman army was 600 miles away in Syria, preparing for an expedition against the Persians farther east in Armenia. For the moment it made no sense to resist the Tervingi and risk the collapse of a key section of the northern frontier. There were advantages, too, in accepting their offer to settle on land south of the Danube. Here the Tervingi could act as a buffer against any future threats from the Huns or other Goths, and their young men could be drafted into the Roman army or employed as mercenaries. Fritigern and Alavivus were certainly aware that Valens was unwilling to offer resettlement to all asylum seekers. A group of Grutungi, also fleeing from the chaos caused by the Huns, was denied permission to enter the empire. They were left to fend for themselves as best they could. For several days and nights the Tervingi were ferried across the Danube at one of its narrowest points, near the garrison town of Durostorum, 60 miles west of the Black Sea. This was a dangerous operation, made more difficult by the fast-flowing river, still swollen by spring rains. Many Tervingi, frustrated by the slow progress and distrustful of Roman military supervision, ventured across in canoes made from hollowed-out logs. The most desperate decided to swim. Some were drowned when overcrowded rafts capsized. Darkness brought only greater confusion. the shouts of terrified families separated in the crush to board the boats, the wash of dead bodies against the banks, and the harsh orders barked by unsympathetic soldiers. The situation was beyond Lupicinus, the Roman commander on the frontier. Without warning, he was faced with 80,000 refugees crammed together in a makeshift camp. The overflowing latrine trenches threatened an outbreak of disease. The stench drifted into nearby Durostorum. Half-starved Goths crowded around the grain wagons whose infrequent deliveries were made under heavy guard. Some paid huge sums for food on the black market. Others were able to buy dog meat only by selling their children as slaves. The going rate was said to be 1 child for each dog. Many of those loyal to Fritigern and Alavivus must have wondered whether they should have followed them into the Roman Empire. Perhaps it would have been better to have stayed behind to support Athanaric and fight the Huns. In early 377, 7 months after the Danube crossing, the internment camp was in danger of slipping out of Roman control. Lupicinus ordered the Tervingi to be moved 50 miles south to Marcianople, a substantial walled town recently strengthened as the base for Valens' 3-year campaign against these same Goths. Lupicinus also decided to deal with Fritigern and Alavivus. He invited them to dinner, but permitted only their bodyguard to enter Marcianople. The unrest in the crowd of Tervingi surging angrily against the barred gates of the city was aggravated by hunger and doubts about the safety of their leaders. Their fears were well-founded. Fritigern and Alavivus had walked straight into a Roman trap. During dinner, Lupicinus had Alavivus and his escort killed, but Fritigern escaped. Lupicinus was later to claim that he had released Fritigern once he had promised to calm the Tervingi now rioting outside the walls. That was probably a lie, a calculated attempt by a second-rate officer to justify a botched operation that should have eliminated both of its targets. Letting Fritigern get away was not Lupicinus' only blunder. The soldiers escorting the Tervingi on their forced march to Marcianople had been drawn from garrisons along the Danube. In their absence, a large number of Grutungi crossed the frontier unopposed. These were the same Goths who earlier had been denied permission to enter the empire. In a serious breach of border security, another 80,000 men, women, and children made it safely into Roman territory. The Grutungi immediately moved south to join the Tervingi outside Marcianople. The combined force wiped out the troops sent by Lupicinus to put down the rebellion that followed Alavivus' murder and Fritigern's escape. With this defeat went any hope that the Goths might be settled peacefully. The Romans were now at war and with a hostile force that had already entered the empire. Initial attempts to restrict the Goths to territory close to the Danube met with little success. In a bold and imaginative move, Fritigern reinforced his army by inviting a contingent of Huns, perhaps 1,000 or 2,000 men, to join the Goths as mercenaries. There could be no starker indication of the Roman failure to manage the crisis. In the fight for survival, some of the Tervingi's most feared enemies had now become their allies. In crossing the Danube, the Goths and their Hun reinforcements confronted an empire that had changed significantly in the 400 years since the first Roman emperor Augustus. The consequences of that transformation were most marked at the beginning of the 4th century. Following the conversion of Constantine, the first emperor to embrace Christianity, the Church benefited from state support and lavish funding. Christianity was now an imperial concern. Pious emperors claimed a close and privileged relationship with Christ. In art, both were shown dressed in royal purple robes. It is unsurprising, then, that Valens insisted the Tervingi convert to Christianity before they were permitted to enter the empire. This proviso reflected not only the emperor's strong personal convictions, but also a genuine belief that the Goths would be more easily integrated if they followed the new faith of the Romans. Constantine's religious revolution was matched by a radical political reformation. In the 2 centuries after Augustus, the security of the empire had been guaranteed by an elaborate network of walls, ditches, and forts. Hadrian's Wall in England is only the most westerly fragment of a defensive system that stretched along the Rhine and the Danube as far as the Black Sea. This extensive cordon was an effective solution to the problem of policing the frontiers. That said, the concentration of military assets along the edges of the empire depended on the absence of civil war and any major external threat that might require the rapid transfer of troops from one frontier to another. From the middle of the 3rd century, such stability could no longer be guaranteed. The causes of the increased pressure along the northern frontier are difficult to trace. It may reflect social changes among those peoples living beyond the Rhine-Danube, the direct result of nearly 3 centuries of contact with the militarized frontier provinces of the empire. Or it may have been simple opportunism, as the Roman need to counter an increasingly aggressive Persia drained manpower and resources to the eastern front. In the 270s, a century before the Tervingi fled the Huns, weakened Danube defences allowed Gothic war bands to raid cities in the Balkans. In the same decade, the Persians pushed as far west as Antioch in Syria and even captured a Roman emperor in battle. Only civil war between rival claimants to the Persian throne had prevented the collapse of the eastern frontier. The Roman Empire survived, but at the cost of its unity. The pressing demands of border security exposed the problems of coordinating and deploying military resources across the Mediterranean world. Against modern expectations, communication times were painfully slow and highly variable. Hadrian's Wall and Antioch were 2,400 miles apart. It could take anywhere between 25 and 135 days after an emperor's death in Italy for officials in Egypt to start dating documents in his successor's name. Seaborne news travelled fastest in the early spring and summer, and slowest in the winter, when navigation was often hazardous and sometimes impossible. Given these constraints, an emperor on campaign against Persia was simply too far away, or too dependent on the loyalty of others, to ensure effective control of Spain or Britain. Despite attempts by some emperors to prevent the fracturing of their authority, by the mid-4th century the empire was split between the east, the Balkans, Turkey, the Middle East and Egypt, and the west, Italy, France, Spain, Britain and North Africa. On some issues the two Roman emperors continued to cooperate. Laws in both halves of the empire were issued jointly in their names. There remained a strong dynastic connection. In the 370s, Valens ruled the east and his nephew Gratian the west. Even so, across the next century, the two Roman empires drifted apart, a process of separation forcibly accelerated by the military and economic costs of dealing with the Goths and the Huns. Strikingly, too, in this new Christian world, Rome was no longer the capital of the Roman Empire, not even of the West. In the final decades of the 4th century, the Western imperial court moved to Milan and then Ravenna in northeastern Italy. Rome was redundant, a crumbling museum to the glories of an imperial past. Its public spaces were crowded with temples, statues, and triumphal arches celebrating the achievements of centuries of generals and emperors who had not fought under the banner of Christ. The East was ruled from a purpose-built city on the Bosphorus, now modern Istanbul. This new model capital was named after its founder, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Whatever Constantine had learned from his conversion to Christianity, it certainly wasn't modesty. On its landward side, the city was protected by a massive wall. At its centre was a large oval forum surrounded by an imposing colonnade. A broad avenue flanked by marble porticos connected the forum to the great palace, whose halls, courtyards and gardens were fortified, walled and secluded, like the Forbidden City or the Kremlin, monuments to the grandeur of imperial power. Adjacent to the great palace, Constantine built a hippodrome on a scale that would stand comparison to the Circus Maximus, the famous chariot racing track in Rome. At 1,400 feet long and 400 wide, it could seat 50,000 spectators. Above all, Constantinople was designed to impress. For one admiring provincial, it was the all-golden city. The midday sun, catching the walls and terraces of some of the finest buildings in the empire, flashed like fire from roofs sheathed in polished bronze. Viewed across the glinting waters of the Bosphorus, the city, as if heated in a crucible, seemed to rise out of a sea of liquid metal. The golden dome of the imperial mausoleum glowed bright on the summit of its highest hill. Even at night Constantinople shimmered. It was one of the few cities in the Roman Empire to have street lighting. The foundation of Constantinople at the beginning of the 4th century altered the political geography of the Mediterranean world. Near the great palace stood the Milion, a marble pillar marking the starting point of the major roads that ran out of the capital and connected it with the provinces beyond. The parallel with Rome was deliberate. In 20 BC, Augustus had placed the so-called Golden Milestone in the middle of the Roman Forum to symbolize the city's position at the center of an imperial world. Then all roads had led to Rome. By the beginning of the 5th century, Constantinople was the undisputed focus of the Eastern Empire. Straddling 7 hills and secure behind its walls, this dazzling imperial capital more than fulfilled Constantine's proud boast to have established a new Rome. Even Augustus, who once claimed to have transformed old Rome from a city of brick into a city of marble, might have been impressed. The revolt of the Tervingi, now reinforced by Greutungi and Huns, directly threatened this new imperial world. Constantinople was only 200 miles from the Danube frontier. Valens had no option but to ensure the safety of the city. Forced to cancel his plans for a campaign in Armenia, he agreed a truce with the Persian king. In April 378 he began the 600-mile march from his headquarters at Antioch. Without mechanized transport, large armies with long baggage trains move slowly. On average, the Roman army covered 15 miles a day. The 6-week journey to the imperial capital was marred by a disturbing incident. As the soldiers left Antioch, they came across a man lying in the road. From the deep welts covering his body, it looked as if he had been whipped from head to foot. He was motionless and said nothing, but stared wide-eyed at all who came near. The emperor was informed, but not even Valens could command him to speak. This was a troubling moment. According to the historian Zosimus, the man could not be considered alive because he did not move, yet he was not completely dead because the eyes seemed bright. Then the body suddenly disappeared. Those who claimed to understand such portents had only ominous explanations to offer. Skilled interpreters concluded that this foretold the condition of the state and that the empire would continue to be beaten and whipped like a dying man. In Constantinople, Valens' mood worsened. Appearing in the imperial box in the hippodrome, he was jeered by a crowd angry at the time it had taken to deploy adequate forces for the empire's defense. It was now nearly 2 years since the Tervingi had crossed the Danube. For an emperor to be insulted in public was a breach of ceremonial decorum. Presiding over a morning's chariot racing, Valens expected to be welcomed by loud applause and the carefully rehearsed praises of the spectators. Instead, he was greeted with catcalls. "Give us the weapons and we'll do the fighting ourselves." Insulted, the emperor left the capital after only 12 days. Some claimed that he had threatened, after dealing with the Goths, to demolish Constantinople and plough the ruins into the ground. Valens had good reason to be confident of success. He had received confirmation that his nephew, the Western Roman Emperor Gratian, was marching to join him. Withdrawing to a country estate not far from the capital, he waited for the reinforcements to arrive. By the end of July, he had held his position for 3 weeks, but Gratian's progress was delayed by the need to secure the Rhine frontier. He had no intention of jeopardizing the defense of the West by helping his uncle fight a war in the East. At the beginning of August, the Goths began to advance, and Valens responded by moving his forces 100 miles northeast to the fortified city of Adrianople. This was an aggressive maneuver. Valens was concerned about the vulnerability of the army's supply lines and, despite his ill-tempered threats, the safety of Constantinople. Most of all, he was tired of waiting for Gratian. When military intelligence reported the number of enemy soldiers at around 10,000, the emperor angrily dismissed those who questioned the estimate. On these figures he could easily defeat the Goths on his own. Why then should he delay and share the glory of victory with his teenage nephew? Valens' offensive alarmed Fritigern. He may have been concerned about the chances of winning a pitched battle against an imperial army at full strength, or he may have been playing for time, waiting for the Grütungi cavalry, then operating independently, to return. Envoys sent to Valens offered peace in exchange for permanent settlement within the empire. A confidential letter stressed Fritigern's eagerness to become the emperor's ally, but warned that many Goths would not accept a truce without a show of force. On no account, he insisted, should Roman troops stand down until an agreement had been reached. Valens dismissed the embassy as worthless and Fritigern's offer of friendship as false, but he followed his advice. The following morning, 9 August 378, 30,000 Roman soldiers left Adrianople. Around noon, the enemy camp was sighted, and the army took up position, infantry units in the centre and cavalry on each wing. Fritigern delayed, still hoping for the arrival of the Grütungi. Another embassy promising peace was rejected, but later that afternoon Valens finally agreed to talks and the exchange of hostages. The emperor's willingness to negotiate reflected a concern for the deteriorating condition of his men. They were fatigued from standing for several hours in the sun and irritated by the smoke from brush fires deliberately started by the Goths. By mid-afternoon it must also have become clear that the number of enemy troops was far greater than expected. Roman scouts had seen only part of the army. Once the Gothic war bands had assembled, Valens faced a force roughly the same size as his own. It must now have seemed sensible to have waited for Gratian. But there was to be no second chance. During the exchange of hostages, one of the frontline Roman units broke ranks, probably an accident on the hot, smoke-obscured battlefield. Once the fighting started, neither side could be held back. The Roman advance was disrupted by the sudden arrival of the Grütungi horsemen, who attacked and dispersed the cavalry covering the army's left flank. The unprotected infantry was quickly surrounded. As the Goths pressed forward, the Roman line was compressed. Amid the heat and dust, many died, crushed by their comrades. Hampered by piles of corpses, the exhausted troops were unable to regroup. They were butchered as they slipped on the blood-soaked ground. Only nightfall put a stop to the slaughter. The Battle of Adrianople was the worst defeat suffered by the Romans for 700 years. Out of 30,000 troops, 20,000 were killed. In the chilling phrase of the imperial court orator Themistius, in one summer afternoon an entire army vanished like a shadow. The impact of this moment of destruction on Roman policy-making cannot be underestimated. Most importantly, the defeat exposed the importance of the Danube frontier to the empire's security. Valens had been critically slow to react to the disruption caused by the emerging menace of the Huns west of the Black Sea. His support of Fritigern hindered Athanaric's attempts to restore order. The crossing of the Tervingi was poorly managed, and their internment and policing were left to barely competent officers. It took over a year to shut down the planned campaign against Persia and redeploy the army. In the meantime, the Tervingi had been joined by a large number of Grütungi and a small group of Huns. The decision to fight at Adrianople without waiting for reinforcements from the west was one of the poorest judgment calls made by any emperor in the history of the Roman Empire. The scale of the defeat was a direct result of Valens' petulant rush to seize victory on his own. During the battle, Valens was hit by an arrow. Wounded, he retreated with his bodyguard and sheltered on the upper floor of a nearby farm building. A band of Goths, not knowing that the emperor was inside, set the building on fire. Despite his desperate attempts, Valens was unable to escape. He died a chokingly painful death, suffocated in the blaze. It seemed a final humiliation that his charred corpse was never recovered. The splendid tomb that Valens had prepared for himself in the imperial capital remained empty. He would never rest in peace in the mausoleum that glittered on the highest hill in Constantinople. Chapter 2. The Axis of Evil. The Huns did not write a single word of their own history. They can be viewed only through the distorting lens of Roman accounts. Writing in the late 380s, a decade after Valens' death, the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus offered his readers a vivid description of the Huns' customs and society. 20 years earlier, they had emerged from the steppes of Central Asia and pushed west of the Black Sea, initiating a complex chain of events that eventually led to the Roman defeat at Adrianople. Of course, no one could blame the Huns directly for this disaster, but
Sample complete. Ready to continue?